Well, thank you very much. My name is Mats Berdal. I'm a professor in the Department of War Studies, and it's a very, very great pleasure to welcome Robert Zoellick to King's College. I don't believe he's been here before, certainly not in this capacity. He doesn't need much of an introduction, obviously. He is the 11th president of the World Bank, but before that has a very, very long history of distinguished public service with the US government, as former trade representative, and also more recently as Deputy Secretary at the US State Department. Of course, he also has a long history of service in the private sector, and we're absolutely delighted that you took time from an exceptionally busy schedule to come and see us today. What we're going to do is to have an interview where I'm going to be talking with you for the next 20-25 minutes or so, and then open up for questions. So without further ado, I was wondering whether I could start just to set the scene. If you could say a little bit about describing the role and the purposes of the World Bank today, and why perhaps also it is involved in the kinds of post-conflict situation it is, something which of course not has always been without controversy. Perhaps start by setting the scene there.
Well, thank you, Matt. Let me thank all of you for coming, first of all. This is a very important day because not only, as all of you know, it's the day before Remembrance Day, but in the United States, this is the Marine Corps birthday. And this has a special meaning related to Britain because, of course, our Marine Corps was founded in 1775 with some unpleasantness with the imperial power. But there's a nice tie that's been developed, and if you ever go to Washington, there's a place, it's kind of has a storied history in our Marine Corps. It's called the Marine Corps Barracks at 8th and I. And it's one of the oldest buildings in Washington. And at least the story goes that when some interlopers with red coats came in 1814 and burnt down all the public buildings in Washington, the Royal Marines decided to save the U.S. Marines Barracks. So it's one of the oldest buildings in Washington, not having been burnt down in 1814. So there was some combative spirit among Marines on November 10th. I also want to say that this is a real delight for me. I was talking with Mats and some of the other faculty beforehand. My true love as a subject is history, but I wasn't sure that I could make a living at it, so I had to go into these other fields, economics and finance. And I've had a very strong interest in military history, and so early on I came across the work of King's College. I had the opportunity to work with Sir Michael Howard a number of years ago and have always been fascinated by his writings, and I just think this is the premier institution in developing this as a field, and so I know for many of you, different stages of your career, it's really a wonderful opportunity I hope all of you have. One of my colleagues here, Alex Ferguson, studied at King's College as an undergraduate and then got the master's degree online in war studies, so it's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you. The World Bank and security. As I hope most of you know, the prime mission and focus for the World Bank is to deal with developing countries and help with growth and poverty. But in some ways, the very origin of the institution, which was in 1944 out of Bretton Woods, was a recognition of the inextricable connection between economics and security, because what these group of founding fathers of the Bretton Woods institutions did in 1944 was to recognize, at least under their assessment, what had been some of the economic causes of conflict and tension in the 19th and 20s and 30s, and they tried to create a new international institutional structure after World War II that would counter that. So you had the IMF to deal with currency and exchange rates to avoid the sort of the beggar thy neighbor policies that you saw in monetary affairs with the end of the gold standard. The World Bank's name, and still part of the institution, was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So the real initial focus was supposed to be the reconstruction of Europe and Japan. Our first loan was to France. And of course, development was a field that was just starting to emerge at this time. Many of these countries were still colonies. And then there was a third organization. It's an interesting little observation about multilateralism. It was called the International Trade Organization, which didn't pass the U.S. Senate. So the GATT, which you may have heard about, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was kind of a substitute for some 30 or 40 years until the World Trade Organization was created in 1994. Now, one of the aspects of my work at the World Bank is that obviously the world has changed enormously since 1944 and today. The World Bank now has 187 countries as shareholders. And perhaps one of the most striking ways that I can emphasize the development is I was at this G20 summit last weekend and pointed out to the leaders of the countries that in the past 5 years, 2/3 of the economic growth has come from developing countries. So what used to be a focus on developing countries, whether as a matter of charity or solidarity, is now frankly a matter of self-interest because these are emerging poles of growth in the world economy. And the World Bank's name actually formed as the World Bank Group because it's evolved with this. And so that IBRD I talked about continues to be our prime lending vehicle for so-called middle-income countries where we make long-term loans that are benefited from our AAA borrowing rate. And a lot of what we bring to bear is not so much the money, but the knowledge and sort of learning experience we've gained from other countries. But in the 50s, there was another institution created called IFC, which is the International Finance Corporation, which lends and invests in private companies. And then in the 60s, something called IDA, the International Development Association, which gives grants and long-term loans without interest to the 79 poorest countries. And in the 80s, a smaller group called MIGA, Multilateral Guarantee Organization. And so as this world is transformed over the course of 50 or 60 years, one of the challenges is for any bureaucracy, public institution like the bank, is how to keep up with it. And that takes us to the particular point about conflict and security. In a way, it goes back to the very name International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The reconstruction in 1944 was Europe and Japan. Reconstruction today is Liberia, Haiti, Southern Sudan, and a host of other countries which in some ways gain greater recognition through the work of Paul Collier. Some of you might have read his book, The Bottom Billion, which is actually about $1.5 billion. Paul had done some work on the economic staff of the World Bank and continued it when he returned to Britain. And what he was able to demonstrate was that statistically, these were countries where you had a cycle of actually negative growth, of slowdown that actually affected their neighbors. And what I observed from my career was that this was a field that the interaction among the players, the military and security staffs, the political individuals, the development teams, often was operated in funnels. They didn't interact very well together. And so the state of the analytical art, as it were, compared to a field like trade policy or nuclear proliferation, was pretty rudimentary. So I thought there was an opportunity at the bank, since we're supposed to cut across some of these areas, to try to see what we could learn and do to try to help these people, not only because 1 billion people or 1.5 billion people is a significant part of the world economy, but also becomes a drag and affects others. And whether it's effect of transporter flows, whether it's breakdown of societies for narcotics, whether it's positions for terrorism, whether it's disease. And so part of what we've been trying to do at the bank is, in a very practical way, learn the experience about what matters most to try to support the development in a multi-dimensional fashion for what are sometimes called fragile or post-conflict states.
I wonder if I can come back a little bit later to the issue of conflict and development, but perhaps stay on the broader theme of the links between economics and security. And you've obviously thought about this for a very long time while you were in government in the US, obviously from the point of view of the private sector. But what sort of reflections do you make on that now from the vantage point of having run or been at the helm of the World Bank during a very, very turbulent period? And it's, of course, impossible to talk about this without reading the papers today and seeing the issue resurfacing in some sense.
Yeah, this is something where I hope I can plant some seeds for some of you, for some of your own work and research. in that I'll again just share with you a little bit of an anecdotal perspective. I sort of went to college in the 70s, so I had graduate school in that period. So the formative period for me in focusing a lot of these issues was the Cold War environment. And so the dominance in what would have been a war studies or political science or governance on these were often issues of how to deal with nuclear threats, how to deal with some of the bipolarity of the Cold War aspects, and then, of course, many of the conflicts that broke out in between. But a very heavily political military focus. And I was struck by this in that my background was a little bit more economics as well as history. And so as I actually look back at sort of U.S. foreign relations and diplomatic history, you could see quite a strong role of economics in the connection with security. But in many of the academic fields in the U.S., the interconnection between these two seemed to get delinked. And just to kind of plant a few seeds for you to think about this, it really starts with mercantilism and the notion that many states had, often royal states, about how you would accrue power through all the resources of the state. So it might start out with land, natural resources, people, ability to access to sea lanes, over time, technology, productive capacity. And if you look at someone like Adam Smith, and it's quite interesting. If you look at Smith, what he actually wrote as opposed to what his disciples wrote, a rather nuanced view, but he was partly challenging the notion of the state as the monopolizer and control of these resources. But in the U.S. case, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, had a concept again of how the economic strength was important to building the young United States, but also its role in the world. Someone like Friedrich List, who actually was a German who was a nationalist of Germany before there was a Germany, at least as a German state, came to the United States, saw some of this, wrote about it. It's a very interesting series of literature that shows this contrast between some of the ideas of state power versus some of the decentralized market power. And just to bring this home in a more practical way, what I've said sometimes in U.S. audiences, but should be closer to home here, is if you study the history of the Napoleonic Wars, you've got any good volume will have wonderful chapters on various campaigns and heroic battles. But perhaps the most valuable chapter is this small, slightly dusty one that people don't want to read, which is the fact that if Pitt the Younger had not rebuilt Britain's credit, so that Britain had the ability to use bond markets to fight a 20-year war, I'm not sure that Britain would have succeeded in the Napoleonic War. So in a sense, Napoleon was a cash taxpayer. He either took or stole what he had to use to fight the war, where Britain had the ability to finance not only itself, but allies and coalitions. Quite significant if you actually look at the long-term effect of it. But if you then even extend this to other periods, and even run it to more current times, in World War II, if you look at the Japanese Empire and the thinking in that period, there were really two schools of thought. One was trying to reach to Southeast Asia for natural resources to strengthen Japan. One wanted to have the land base in China. They basically tried to do both and overreached and led to a conflict with the United States and other powers in the Pacific. Hitler's notion, which was driven by many ideas, but when you look at kind of the sordid ideology, the notion of Lebensraum was quite significant in terms of the concept of, again, geography and space and people and growth. In more recent times, I was at the U.S. State Department at the very end of the Cold War, played a role in Germany's unification, and I think still one of the underappreciated aspects of the fall of the Soviet Union was the price of oil in the 80s. If you go back and you look at the price of oil, that was one of the big declines, and they went down about $15, $16 a barrel. Even today, if you look at Russia's economy, most people feel it's a play on energy and natural resources. And if you could imagine what would happen to Russia today if the price of oil went down to $15 or $16 a barrel. This was a very significant effect about trying to maintain the Soviet military machine. Or at the end of the Cold War, in 1990, when Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, that was seen as a domination of oil markets and world energy markets. But to even bring this in more current times, the work that I imagine a lot of you have been involved with counterinsurgency, it's hard to get much of a counterinsurgency topic without talking about how local people will have some sense of ownership in their own development, their own economic prospects, their own sense of governance. That's a big economic portion. We at the World Bank right now are doing some work with a number of governments about the economic effects of the withdrawal from Afghanistan and what might be a negative multiplier effect and what effect this will have on the government of Afghanistan's ability to fund something like the military in Afghanistan. One of the interesting things is the plans that you see for the Afghan military are somewhat disconnected with the ability to fund that military unless someone's going to step in and fund it. So these are the sort of questions people have to face. Even something like Darfur, which I spent a lot of time on, 2005, 2006, as many of you know as students of these, there's many causes of conflict, but some of the climatic changes which led to potential tensions between more settled agricultural populations and nomadic populations, in my view, was manipulated by authorities in Khartoum. And so this was, again, would it alone have caused conflict? Perhaps not, but does it cause the basis for potential conflict? So my point is really just that I think that the field of strategic studies, if you will, which might be how war studies was more done in the case of the United States, tended to emphasize more, if I'll say, the guns and bombs and the deterrence theory. And I honestly think that if you go back and you look at the history of the economic policy, look at the discussion right now in the newspaper about Iran. One of the people will say, well, what sanctions? And then they say, well, what type of sanctions? And do we sanction individuals? What would have happened if we went to the gasoline industry? And there's obviously research done on smart sanctions versus broad-based sanctions and so on and so forth. So if I have a plea for you in this field, it's that in addition to whatever other topics you're looking at, try to think a little bit more broadly about the economic and security topics, because going back to my comment about what's happening in emerging markets and their growing role, you're really, I don't want to overstate it, but you're really living in a period of a potential power shift here. And for a lot of emerging markets, I can assure you economics is the primary interest. If you go out to East Asia, that will be the topic of discussion. And so I'll just leave you with this thought. Some of what we're even seeing within financial markets is not only financial issues, it's questions of power and perceptions of power, and a lot of that flows from economics.
Yeah. On that very subject, I mean, you've recently spoken, and you did it again now, I suppose, about tectonic plates shifting, and that we need, in your words, a new sort of modernizing multilateralism to better recognize and reflect those economic shifts that are taking place in the world. I wonder if you care to elaborate upon your meaning of modernizing multilateralism. I mean, one other thing you said in that speech was also that we need everyone to be responsible stakeholders, and that we have a role to play as well. I wonder whether you would like to say a bit more about the...
Yeah, well, let me start with the responsible stakeholder and move on. That was an allusion to the fact when I was Deputy Secretary of State, I gave a speech in 2005, and I was trying to... China had now gotten into the World Trade Organization as part of the international economic system. And I had a strategic dialogue with China, and I was trying to frame what would be a U.S. or broad approach to China. And I used this phrase, responsible stakeholder, to try to draw attention to the fact that China, since Deng Xiaoping, had benefited enormously from this world economic system that I described that was created after World War II. It was a stakeholder in the system. It benefited from the trade and the capital flows and development. And I was making the case that the U.S. view, but also the Chinese view, should be to have China over time share in the responsibilities of the system as being a stakeholder. Now, I'll share with you one other wonderful diplomatic tool and trick that I developed totally unknowingly, which is it turned out that stakeholder is not an easily defined term in Chinese, something I didn't know. But this turned out to be a brilliant unintended step because it created this big debate in China. People were, stakeholder, what does it mean? And so actually the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about the big debate in China about the meaning of stakeholder. And of course when you give a speech, the best compliment you can give is that when people will actually debate and talk about it. I later met one of the Chinese embassy officials who told me he stayed up till 4 a.m. the night I gave the speech, writing a cable back, trying to make the argument that this was a positive thing for China to be doing. But obviously, the responsible, in addition to the stakeholder, did have a twist, which was the idea that, well, who will sit in judgment about being responsible in staking and holding? And I was obviously trying to connect it to the international system of the day. And that goes to my point that I made about everybody being responsible stakeholders now. And I was using this partly in the context of the developed world and the problems of today's economic problems, in making the argument that the events in the Eurozone in Europe have their overflow effects on developing countries, and so that developed countries also recognize they too needed to be responsible stakeholders in the system. And so when people are dealing with Italy's debt and others, it's not just a Eurozone question, it's a question for the world economy. On modernizing multilateralism, it flows a little bit from some of the points that I touched on. So, when I was in college and graduate school, we learned about these Bretton Woods institutions as kind of a counter to the breakdown of the system in the 20s and 30s. It was the idea that this was an intergovernmental form of cooperation, but building institutional capacities. It's very thin tissue in a world of nation states. But nevertheless, part of what I was suggesting is now and then you find people that say, well, these institutions, they've run their course, let's abandon them, or let's try to make a unitary world government system, but that doesn't seem to have very much public legitimacy. You can see the struggle in the European Union itself as it's trying to share sovereignty. And so in some ways it's a very practical recognition that you have to modernize the multilateral system, modernize it in terms of votes, how you treat the clients. And so here you get into the particulars of each institution. One that we talked about with the World Bank a little bit beforehand is many of you either know or perhaps you participated in the demonstrations against the World Bank and IMF at various points. They became perceived as sort of old-line, bureaucratic, impervious institutions. So part of, when you're running an institution like that, one way to counter it is you try to open it up. So I created the first Freedom of Information Act policy at the institution, which is built on both the U.S. and Indian models in that we don't just release a positive list of documents, but we have what we call a negative list, which means everything's open unless it's an excluded category, and we actually have a panel of judges, in effect, judge whether something's covered or not. We have an open data initiative we've talked about to try to open up our data sets to much wider use. So there are aspects about management of the institution, how you treat the clients, how you run the institution with the types of respecting the issues that might be of the day, food security, infrastructure with public-private investments, other things, but also some of these broader aspects. You see this going on right now in the debate with the IMF and the Eurozone, and the question about what resources you may get from emerging markets and what effect it has on voting shares. And you see it, if you read the newspaper about the G20, recall that until a few years ago, you would have been reading about G7 summits. And G7 came out of the mid-'70s experience. And the G20 was actually created in the late 90s after the East Asian crisis, but it was made as a summit level after the financial crisis in 2008. And it has all the challenges that you would expect. On the one hand, it's got broader representation, which is good. On the other hand, it's bigger, which means it's harder to get things done. It has the danger of being bureaucratized, as the G8 is. And ultimately, it's still in the hands of the individual nation states. Now, it's interesting. One of the comments I wrote at a different point was that the G20 is a group for our era because the numbers don't add up. There's actually about 25 countries and about 4 or 5 international heads at the meeting. Of those 25 countries, you probably still have maybe 7 or 8 that are from Europe, plus the head of the European Commission, the European Presidency, the European Presidency country. So here's something for all of you to reflect on from a European context. You can imagine if you're sitting there from a developing country, and the whole discussion over the weekend was predominated by the travails of the Eurozone, and you ask yourself, we thought these were relatively developed, wealthy countries. They're the ones that are threatening all of us. They want to be overrepresented at the meeting, and they can't get their act together. What do you think effect that's going to have on attitudes of power over time? It's a rhetorical question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But then I was wondering on that, your colleague at the IMF yesterday was making the point, I believe in China, that we might have another lost decade if the Eurozone doesn't get its act together. And you pointed out there are consequences for the developing world as well. I wonder whether you'd care to reflect on what the consequences might be, in terms of the broader issues of power shifts as well.
Well, I'll touch on this in 2 ways. One is, what was interesting is after the financial crisis in 2008, you actually saw a multi-speed recovery. So emerging markets were recovering quite well. If anything, until August, their risk was overheating, inflation, interest rates. So developed world, by and large, had high unemployment, low growth, large sovereign debts. Not all countries, Canada and Australia, for various reasons, in a different position. But that was basically the Eurozone, U.S., Japanese position. But what happened in August was quite striking, and this is what we're actually living through today. You may remember there was a meeting in Europe in late July, which was the agreement to set up this EFSF, this funding facility, this backstop. And it was going to take 17 Eurozone parliaments to pass it. What started to happen in August was the markets started to lose faith in the governance. It wasn't so much just the economics and finance. They started to distrust whether the governments could either stay ahead of the problem or catch up to the problem. And so this is where the European Central Bank had to step in and start to buy Italian and Spanish bonds to calm things down. But this was a particular note to me. I was actually in Australia shortly after this because I'd mentioned that developing countries had been recovering quite well, but all of a sudden their equity markets started to take a hit of over 20%. Their bond yields, so their spread over, say, U.S. Treasuries started to go up. Many of them, their currencies started to fall. The trade numbers started to slip. And what I was particularly attentive to was that if the confidence problems that had affected Europe and the United States started to slip to the confidence of business, investors, and consumers in developing markets, then this growth that I referred to from the developing world that was partly propping things up would slide away, and we would be in an even much more difficult situation. Now, with the Eurozone agreement that was done a few weeks ago, the numbers started to come back. But frankly, what we're now seeing again, and it's interesting for a student of markets as well as government, is that the markets are judging whether the government will follow through. It's not just the plan, it's the trust in the governments. This is what you see going on right now in Italy and Greece, and whether the system can defend itself. So that the effects are, trade, the financial system, and this is something I mentioned to the G20 leaders just last weekend. Let's just take the Eurozone agreement on bank capital. One of the effects we're already starting to see is, and this shows how it's kind of interesting to connect the institutions of how things work with kind of market theory. Trade finance is a very short-term loan. It rolls over quickly. So if you're a European bank and you need to get your capital ratios up, one way you do it is you raise capital. The other is you lower assets. So you let the trade finance roll off quickly. It's fast to go. But trade finance is a rather labor-intensive sort of institutional business. You have to have the relationships and others. So it's not so easy to replicate. So we at the World Bank, through IFC, our private sector arm, we're actually trying to step in and replicate it. But we're already starting to see in West Africa and other parts of the world the trade finance starting to slip. Southeastern Europe. A lot of the banks in the Balkans are owned by Europeans, some of them Greek banks. So you want to understand the connection between economics and security? If you're living in a tinderbox and all of a sudden you get a credit contraction, and all of a sudden, if you're in Serbia or Macedonia or others, the things get a lot tighter, or Romania or Bulgaria, which have their own difficulties, you can add to the fragility of the political situation. So again, we're trying to work with the EBRD on these topics. North Africa, which is obviously in the news. If you look at the trade patterns of a lot of the North African states, very dependent on European Union market. So if the European Union slips into recession, it's not going to be good for Tunisia and Egypt and others at a time that they've already got their own set of problems. So what I'm partly trying to, it also gives you a little sense of how the World Bank has changed, but the interconnections of the economics and security. But the last part, when you reference kind of what it also means for the developing world, there's one other aspect of this modernizing multilateralism that I'll flag for your attention, and it goes back to this responsible stakeholder idea. So one has to make sure you have the perspective of the developing countries. One has to keep in mind that still 2/3 of the people living under $2 a day live in so-called middle-income countries. If you go to many Indian states, the human development characteristics are worse than many African states. You've been reading about in the Financial Times or others about how will China bail out the Eurozone. The average per capita income in China is about $4,000. It's about $38,000 in Europe. So it's not, even if they wanted to, it's not so easy to say, well, why should we be bailing out people who are 10 times richer than we are? So this is a sensitivity that is different from the past international sharing of responsibility. Many of the developing countries realize they have a stake in the system. They're willing to do something, but they say, well, wait a minute. We need some special treatment here because we're still not at the level of development. And the reason I flag this is that you cannot find an issue today, trade, development, investment flows, climate change, that doesn't come back to this tension, because a lot of the developed countries are going to say, wait a minute, we take care of carbon, China produces it, all of it, how would that work for us? But China says, well, wait a minute, we're only a tenth as rich as you are. We still have to have this development. So for many of you in your careers, this challenge of how you mediate these and try to modernize the multilateralism so people find the mutual points of cooperation as opposed to tension, I think is going to be the big challenge. And a point I've made in some U.S. audiences I'll make here is, I think in the security field as well, people are just beginning to grasp the implications of this. Obviously, when you think about it with the Indian nuclear deal and other aspects. But over the next 10 or 20 years, I just think it's going to become even more important.
Let me return with one final question before I open up and come back to the issue of conflict, security, and development. And I was there when you gave a talk in Geneva at the ISSS on fragile states and securing development. And that led to work on the World Development Report of last year, 2011. Now, of course, the World Bank started working in post-conflict zones some time back, and indeed your predecessor, James Wolferson, set up a task force on fragile states in 1995. So my question is partly what made you prioritize the issue again very early when you came back in again, and perhaps also what lessons from that report are directly relevant to your work, and perhaps just to finally to abuse the privilege of doing this. One of the criticism, of course, that was labelled, although more directly against the IMF than the World Bank, was Stiglitz in his book on globalization. Not that he had a problem with that in itself, but that the Washington consensus was being imposed in a dramatic fashion without proper attention to sequencing. Has anything replaced the Washington consensus in terms of that package of macroeconomic stability and liberalization and privatization? And what is different now in 2011?
Those are three big questions. I'll try to be brief so we get in, the audience can follow up on these if I'm too brief. On the first one, the reason that I wanted to focus on it was what I referred to before. From my own experience, I could just feel that these communities of security, economic development were not as integrated. And we'd had practical experience, but let's try to learn from it. The World Bank does a World Development Report every year as kind of a flagship piece of economic research and outreach, and others. We've done one this recent year on gender and development, which is quite fascinating. It actually relates to this in some ways. And so it was a way of trying to pull this together. The second point is The very nature of this field made this a slightly different World Development Report than others. So, for example, we did one on agriculture, and you can come up with very good statistical analyses of the effect of agricultural production on reducing poverty in different areas. This one was a little bit more experimental. And I think that's why this is kind of an interesting field. It's going to continue to be experimental. But there were some preliminary, at least, impressions that we tried to draw. One is the importance in a post-conflict or fragile state of building an institutional framework, and we were talking about this in a combination with also leadership, but also of having real results in real time. In other words, if you wait to do the perfect institution, you're going to be too late. So you have to combine getting things done, get the garbage picked up, start to show some improvement in life, while doing it in a way that's trying to build institutional capacity for the future. Second, the issues that were most prominent for people are citizen security, and here I don't only mean sort of war and conflict, but police that are protectors as opposed to predators, justice and jobs. And justice doesn't necessarily mean, formal Westminster justice. It means what is accepted with people is kind of the notion of being a fair system, and may often based on local practices. A third aspect that was important is, and it relates to the institutions, and I saw this challenge in my own experience. Outsiders will come in and want to do these things, but development only works if the local people own it. So frankly, you can have the best ideas, the best money, the best people. If the local people don't own it, it's not going to work. So you have to build what we refer to as inclusive enough coalitions. And this is, of course, in the eye of the beholder. If you wait to get everybody on board, again, you may, you'll lose the trade-off between results and inclusion. But you want to build enough in terms of inclusiveness so that you can have the basis for sort of building institutional capacity. Another aspect is that, and this goes a little bit to your observation from Stiglitz, let's take jobs. And this was a wonderful example. When I would deal with soldiers in the field, one of their first points would be, for God's sakes, let's get these people to work. Otherwise, you got a bunch of, young people that, somebody may pay them to be disruptive, they may plant mines, otherwise they'll be gangs, so let's get them to work. Okay. You go to the economists and they'll say, well, we can't do make-work jobs. That's crummy, that's bad economic policy. We have to get the macroeconomic framework right, then we get the microeconomics, get the privatization, and so on and so on. And it's just too long. And so one of the things that we've done some experiments with is what types of programs can you have that create jobs in the short term that aren't disruptive of creating your long-term economy. A lot of this will depend on wage rates. A lot of it will depend, you can do various sort of food for work projects and others that give sustenance to different things. So that's a good example of what I'll call a pragmatism in trying to deal with this. Another lesson goes to the fact that, many times it's the nature of policy making. I've been, I'm sure, victim of this too. It's hard enough to work on an individual country. But if you're only looking at the country and you're not looking at kind of the layers of the neighbors of the country, the regional, the international, you're going to miss something. I mean, how can you understand what's going on in Afghanistan unless you know what's going on in Pakistan? I mean, so, and frankly, if you look at, the effects of the spillover from Liberia to Sierra Leone, look at what's happened in Cote d'Ivoire. Cote d'Ivoire was the cornerstone of development in what was called French West Africa. So if you visited Cote d'Ivoire, you see infrastructure much better. So when Cote d'Ivoire was blowing up, when frankly it's going to affect all the trade and economic patterns through much of the region. So one of the challenges today will be as sort of Western forces leave Afghanistan, what regional arrangement do you sort of create in this context? And another aspect, and this is where, in a sense, there are more insights for somebody in this situation. I talked about the gender aspects. More than is generally recognized, integrating women into the economic process, the decision-making process, seems to have a solidifying effect on cohesion in the communities. We definitely have data that shows you give money and support to the woman head of household, that you get much better nutrition and health for the children and things like that. But it also sort of the larger commitment to the communities and the governance. So that's another aspect. Private sector development. Obviously, you want to try to create an environment where it's not a total state domination, particularly where you have a weak state. So what can you do in terms of trying to create some of the basic sort of property rights, entrepreneurial opportunities? How can the assistance programs build on the local talent? Now let me give you another example from Afghanistan. And this shows a little bit how we at the bank tried to work differently from some of the others. Our model in Afghanistan, and this wasn't me, this was other people, they did a fantastic job, was find an honest minister, work with the minister to try to develop a program that would work with whatever capacity they had, and then build it over time. So there was a preventive health care program developed in Afghanistan that's really had huge effects on infant mortality and maternal mortality. And basically, it's outsourced to NGOs and civil society groups, some local, some international. But it's run through the healthcare ministry, so the healthcare ministry does have responsibility. It's not a foreigner's program, it's an Afghan program. And we've had similar experience with some community development programs called the National Solidarity Program, where you give small sums of money to the community. They decide how it's to be used and spent. They have the ownership. It's their priority. So part of this is the hard-earned experience about combining local ownership with results while slowly trying to build the institutions and capacity for the future. The other fact of life, which is just not always pleasant for people to recognize, is don't expect to turn these around so quickly. I mean, I worked on German unification, so I look at Central and Eastern Europe 20 years on, and that's still a work in process. So if you think Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire are going to be turned around overnight, think again.
We'll open up for questions. And will you be kind and try to keep it short, and please introduce yourself. We don't have a great deal of time, so let's open up for questions. Let's start with Funmi. Do we have a microphone? Start right here. So we're going to start with Funmi, and then we'll go. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much. I think you covered a broad range of things.
Now, I know who you are because I've been introduced, but you have to, under the rules.
I'm sorry. Yes, absolutely. Funmi Olonishake, I'm Director of the African Leadership Center here at King's. Economics and security. Very, very true. Big question is, what is at the intersection? Can we avoid politics? If we take Africa as a good example of a potential emerging market, and the idea is beginning to gain ground that Africa might be the rescue ground for the global financial crisis because of its 1 billion people, its raw market, and many of those countries are not yet systematically linked to the global economy, so they might recover faster, and I think you alluded to that. Can you deal with that continent and its insecurity problems without dealing with politics and dealing with recalcitrant political leaders who are not willing to change and buy some of the ideas of justice and jobs and citizen security that you're talking
about? No. Very unlike most policy answers. But there's lots of interesting ideas embedded there, and let me just draw a couple. First, the potential of Sub-Saharan Africa. Many people are not aware that Sub-Saharan Africa grew on average about 5% a year for 10 years before the crisis, and actually recovered quite well since then. And as an example of policy and development, many of you remember there were big articles and written about the digital divide and so on and so forth, and how the world needed to pour a lot of public money in to avoid this. By changing the regulatory structure for telecommunications in Sub-Saharan Africa, over the past 10 years, there's been $77 billion of private investment in mobile telephony that has increased the cell phone usage, I don't know exactly this, but I think it's from about 10 million to 400 million. And what's also been quite interesting is now many of those countries are in the forefront of using mobile telephony for banking systems and health systems and other types of things. So from an investment perspective, one part of the bank I mentioned is IFC, our private sector side. We created an asset management corporation because in addition to our traditional way of raising money in debt markets and investing, I thought I wanted to tap potential pension funds and sovereign funds to invest, and we put together $1 billion investment fund for Sub-Saharan Africa, some diversity in Latin America and the Caribbean. And just to give you a sense, when I approached one Dutch pension fund manager who came in, and I said, now tell me why you wanted to invest in this. They said, well, we now know developed markets are risky too. We think the growth is going to be in these markets. We have some familiarity in East Asia and others. We really don't know these markets. So the way an economist would call it, the information cost, the transactions cost. We'll invest with you and we'll learn and we'll, as part of an overall portfolio, have reasonable returns. So I really do believe that Sub-Saharan Africa can become a pole of growth. So in terms of the opportunity, as you know, it's quite diverse. You've got about a third of the population in countries that are basically what they want is regional integration, energy, transportation, private sector development. They want the integration that Europe wanted 50 years ago, but they're more private sector than Europe was 50 years ago, to be honest. There's another third that are natural resource producers and oil, and for them it's really a question of governance and whether they have inclusive growth and they fight the corruption and the breakdown that natural resource societies have. And the other third are the bottom billion, the broken states. So, but even so, the averages are quite good. But it goes, the point that I'll close with is the one that you wanted to emphasize, which is, and this is an interesting lesson for us at the bank. Of course, politics affects the development of governance and institutions. When I came to the bank, not surprisingly, since we're a multilateral institution, we're supposed to be involved with economics, not politics, some people wanted to shy away from this topic. And they wanted to give the textbook solution. We have to walk a very fine line. My own view, the point I've tried to say is, we need to work with countries as clients. And that means you need to understand the setting in which a problem occurs. If you come and you produce a textbook solution, but it doesn't work in the country, you haven't solved the problem. And therefore, you have to have some understanding of the political economy and the institutional framework. Just take my Afghan example. You might have a great health system designed for, China or India, but it doesn't work in the Afghan experience. And so, in some ways, it's a cop-out to say, oh, well, we're not going to be involved with this because that's politics. So, on the other hand, we are part of a multilateral system. I can't go depose people. You have to sort of figure out how you try to deal with these issues. But there normally are tools through your own use of governance and anti-corruption and transparency. Let me give you a small one that I instituted, but it just shows how some of these changes are incremental. We sometimes give support directly to a budget as opposed to through overall sort of investment loan projects. One of the decisions that I made was, I said, how can we ever justify giving money to a country's budget if they don't publish their budget? I said, how can I defend that? And so now, there's always, any good policy always has an exception, and so like there are some post-conflict states where they may not have the budget published right away, that we may want to give some to the budget to build the capacity. And so we said, okay, we give 12 months or something to produce some budget. Now this led to endless meetings at the bank about, well, what's a quality budget, and so on and so forth. And that's okay, that's all the work that has to be done. But it makes your point, which is that, of course, these are inextricably linked. And going to the natural resource producers, for many of these countries, the real question is, whether somebody will steal it, or whether it'll just benefit a small few, or whether it will lead to an inclusive growth, or how they'll manage the exchange rate to avoid the Dutch disease. So I was congratulating the colleagues because you were talking about rebuilding political economy. And I thought the economic profession got on the wrong track about 100 years ago when it left political economy behind and went to economy.
The gentleman up there.
I'm Theo Milanopoulos. I'm a Fulbright scholar here at King's and was just finished working with your former colleague Condi Rice on her memoirs.
I just bought them.
Good. All right. We're hoping for a bestseller. You talk a lot about the relationship between economics and security. What seems less discussed here is the role of democracy in development. and I'm curious to know about how, given your involvement with the MCC as Deputy Secretary of State, what role does democratic reform play as a priority in promoting development and the activities of the World Bank, given these alternative models to, like authoritarian capitalism that have emerged?
Yeah. Well, as a multilateral institution with 187 shareholders, many of which are not democracies, we can't be formally saying we're there to advance democracy. We can say we are there to try to make sure there's good governance, there's inclusive participation, and we can point out, and this goes a little bit, I'm sorry I didn't answer the part about the Stiglitz question, the practical experience from other countries, including, say, China. You'll see China is also increasingly attentive about taking the temperature and polls and attitudes of the public. And what we can show is that societies that succeed over time figure out a way to try to represent views. And there's different political systems, different ways to do that. I obviously have my own personal preference for democratic systems. But I don't believe one can argue that you cannot develop without a democratic system. I mean, look at China as an example of that. You can certainly come up with theories, and there's been lots of debate about this, about whether in the process of development countries will move to democratic systems. So if you look at the history of East Asia, and you look at Taiwan, you look at South Korea, you look at the Indonesian process and a transformation to democracy, you can make that argument. But in my sort of world of sort of development and development politics, I don't have to extend it that far. I can make the argument about transparency, clean government, and I hope over time those will become the conditions for greater participation. But let me give you an example where, but and also in a practical terms, let's take the events in North Africa. Where you can, you want to try to support those, for example, in Tunisia, where after the revolutionary events, we worked very closely with the interim government to not only provide them financial support, but the experience we've had about open information processes, administrative law and judicial processes, sort of anti-corruption efforts, and also drawing in some of the gender issues. So we tried to do some things related to our gender development report as they were approaching the elections, because I think there was some concern among some of the women's groups about being left out of the system. So it's like a lot of things in policy. You can have a lot of handles and may not be a direct one. I think one of the interesting both policy and scholarly questions, though, is this one about as countries get to certain levels of income, will you have a middle class that will press for democracy? But that's one that time will tell.
Down in the front here. You have
just one other thought on this, because it's interesting. I was just reflecting, because I've obviously been kind of deeply involved with the events of Greece and the Eurozone over the past week or two. Not surprisingly, the first reaction of everybody when the Greek Prime Minister, Papandreou, decided to have a referendum is, where did that idea come from? It's the last thing. But, there's another aspect of this that, in some ways, that may be the canary in the coal mine, telling people that if you're going to sustain these policies, you've got to be able to have public support in a democratic system. And so it'll be interesting to watch how that plays out. In some ways, having Greece decide whether it was willing to take these sacrifices to stay part of the EU or the Eurozone may be something that has to be addressed over time. So I'm extending your question a little bit because it's in my mind in a Eurozone context. You have right now a debate going on about technocratic policies to get out of a financial hole, which make a lot of sense, but you can never forget that, particularly in this period that we're in now, you're going to have to sustain public support for this, and in democracies that sometimes goes through some difficult periods. I'm sorry.
My name is Karen Christensen. I'm the director of Publish What You Fund, which is the global campaign for the transparency of aid. But also in a previous life, I worked a lot on counterinsurgency policy and fragile states, so it's a combination of many of my interests. one quick point on fragile states and politics, and then I wanted to mention something about the link with that and aid transparency.
Can you hear her back there?
Is that...
Can you speak just a little
Speak
louder?
into the mic.
Yeah, into the mic.
Okay. So the first thing, this is a reflection from working on fragile states for some time, was that, and really building on the question earlier, I think the starkest lesson for me for the last 20 years is once we stopped fighting, I think it's called proxy wars in Africa, that's when the growth rates took off. And that's where the governance started to improve. So there's something about the politics that I think we have to be quite careful about, because it's also about our politics in the north or the west or whatever we want to call it, about how we project that on. And Africa has made huge strides in terms of poverty reduction, conflict deaths, growth rates, and a lot of them track back to about post-Cold War. So I think that's, that was perhaps the biggest achievement of the NTG. So on the fragile states thing, I think we also know that thus aid can do harm as well as good if done poorly or used in very particular ways. And that's acknowledged, but I think sometimes we need to be particularly aware of that, which takes me to my last couple of points. One is around transparency. A lot of people think aid transparency as a means or an end. There's lots of debates about that. This is very much a means and an end. It's an end in itself. If you're in a highly aid-dependent context, not knowing what 70% of the flows in your country are, if you're Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, for example, you can't plan your own budget. You can't do your own politics in that context. And a brief plug as a consequence, we have a report coming out next week on a new ranking of donors. I'm not going to tell you where you come. But the bank does reasonably well. However, US agencies don't, apart from the MCC, which is an interesting one, and it's still the largest aid flows globally, so it would be great to have your reflections from your former life on how you transfer the experience within the bank, where you have been making great strides, to some of those. What do we do about that problem? And I think the last question was, therefore, we've got this higher level forum on aid effectiveness coming up in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks' time now, in Busan. And the signals are really bad, actually, that donors are actually slipping back on this rhetoric of understanding that their job has to be to start with by doing no harm. We love talking about what partner countries and developing countries should do, but that agenda actually seems to be going backwards. And I think we need political leadership right now, because some of my best friends are civil servants, but they're not actually getting to grips, and they're not using this forum properly to actually solve the problems that have been acknowledged over 50 years as to how we actually get aid to work best.
Okay, well, a lot of topics here, so let me just check on this one. Let me start with your basic point about transparency. And as you know, Aaron, something that we've advanced and tried to promote at the bank. But just to underscore your basic point, it's not only in the institution's self-interest to open itself up, but if you believe that development has to be owned by a country, then you have to build, it's part of building the institutions and the participation within the country and helping countries understand what other countries have done. I mean, it's often not nefarious. It may just be lack of experience about how you can draw in broader participation in a society. One of my favorite examples, so it's slightly overused, I apologize, but it's a good one to drive home the point, is that we spend a lot of effort to fight corruption. But one of the best anti-corruption examples that I have is sort of an education support program where people put on the door of the local school that this program was supposed to provide 100 textbooks and 2 teachers, and allows people in the neighborhood to say, well, only 1 teacher showed up and we only got 50 textbooks. Who's responsible for this? And so the point being that the best safeguards of effective use are the community, but you've got to empower the community. And there's things you can do through the development programs to empower the community, and information and transparency is obviously very critical to that. The other thing is, and this is hard in the development field, and it's not blaming anybody. I think the lesson I've had over the years is you have to accept reality in human nature. It's kind of and part of it is people have worked very hard on development programs. And sometimes they put their heart and souls into them. They work on them for years. They make huge personal sacrifices. And it's very hard to admit they don't work. So one of the things that I've tried to emphasize at the bank, and I'm sure there's a lot more we can do to get better on this, is that the transparency is also not only to fight corruption, but it's so that we can get better at what we do, so that we can learn that what sort of should have worked, could have worked, would have worked, didn't work, and so that we can, learn from that. Now, there's no shame in admitting that sometimes things don't work. If poverty were so easy to eliminate, somebody would have come up with the answer long ago. These are tough issues. Dealing with countries in these difficult situations are not easy. So it's partly trying to adjust people's mindset. And this also goes back, I keep forgetting the Stiglitz point, is that a lot of, I think when you talked about sort of Washington consensus, there's a lot in the Washington consensus about macroeconomic stability and property rights that makes a lot of sense. I think the issue is what part of this transformation that I've talked about is what's really changed over the past 10 years is now there's a huge amount of opportunity for what I'll loosely call self-learning. There's practical experience, practical pragmatic experience about what has worked with, say, Mexico's conditional cash transfer program, which focuses on the poorest but has people get health and health checkups and education, has now been replicated in 40 different countries. Okay, and it's often much more real for people in developing countries to be able to experience what other developing countries have done as opposed to what comes out of a textbook in London or the U.S. or Paris or Berlin or something or Tokyo. But this all expands to this notion that you had about transparency and ownership and sort of creating the debate and willingness to sort of pursue things to the end and fix things when they don't work. So that's also a little bit my answer to you and Busan, is that I think we have to keep pushing this notion. And the encouraging thing is, if we actually get this right, we're also going to find a lot of South-North examples. So let me just take this back to a different context. In the United States now, you've got a lot of states that are in very difficult financial position. When I studied accounting, there were two sides of the balance sheet. There were something called assets as well as liabilities. It's interesting that we can work with Chongqing in China to monetize a road, a toll road system, and so that you can help have private financing of a public asset. But the state legislature in Pennsylvania stopped the same thing. So they didn't want to have, any private money in toll roads, but in communist China, it's okay to privatize toll roads. There's a lot you can learn here from developing countries about different models. And that's the good thing, because taking this European issue a next step, all of what we talked about are sort of macroeconomics and debt. At some point, somebody's got to get back to growth. And there's a lot of lessons about growth that are coming from emerging markets that could be used more broadly in developed markets, too.
I think we have time for one final question.
There's this one woman, you haven't seen her.
Still one more. So why don't we do that, and then we have to close because another engagement. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is May, and I'm doing my postgrad in international relations here at King's. If I may, 3 short questions for you, Mr. Zoellick.
Where are you from?
Singapore. First question for you is the fact that the EU just recently commented that with the debt crisis, Europe is likely to go into a new recession next year. Do you agree with that, and do you expect that impact to be even greater than what we've seen in 2008? Second question is, you talked about the loss of faith by developing countries. What kind of concern do you have when we talk about Southeast Asian countries retreating in terms of from the financial markets, and what kind of impact will that have on the much needed growth that we need today? And my final question for you is, the APEC leaders are meeting up this weekend. What kind of a role do you expect them to play in the realm of things right now? Thank you.
Okay. Sure sign of a Singapore education there. I say this with great fondness for Singapore. On your first question, I'm always wary of making economic forecasts. It's just because the ones that I read rarely turn out to be the case. So I'm not going to go on record and say there will be a recession in Europe, but I will say that I think in probabilities. The probabilities have increased considerably. There's many people forecasting it, and that will not be good for the international economy. Okay? I do think that the U.S. economy is likely to stumble along at reasonable levels. And so I don't think that the world economy is necessarily going to be tipped into something. But this is coming back to our reference about what's going on right now in the Eurozone. Remember what I said about confidence. This is the variable that's very hard to read. So, if this is not handled effectively and you get the ripple effects become wave effects, then this could slide much worse. So part of what I do in life is to try to do the little things I can to move the probabilities in a slightly different direction. Your second question was Southeast Asia?
That's right.
Yeah, Southeast Asia. Well, I think by and large that the general growth prospects in Southeast Asia still remain reasonably good. If you're an open economy like Singapore, obviously you're affected by a lot of these global economic conditions. The events in August actually took a little bit of steam off what was the potential overheating, and so in countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, this is still, I think they still got reasonable growth prospects. But, and I think this is a compliment to the Southeast Asian countries, there's still a focus on a lot of the, what I'll call the structural contributors to growth, whether it be some of the infrastructure development, trying to bring more competition to the service sector and others in Southeast Asia, and there's still a long way to go in that, so I'm basically bullish about that. But Southeast Asia, like Latin America, is very dependent on the Chinese market. And I think China will still have significant growth, a little bit less than it had before. But over time, China is also something we're working on. It's going to have to change its growth model. It can't rely on export-led, investment-led growth. So these will have implications for the region. So part of the lesson here is nobody can get smug. So even in Southeast Asia, where I think there's been some good growth potential, people are going to have to continue to adjust going forward. The liquidity issues that I touched on, I think, bear watching, okay, because I was looking at some of the statistics about this. This gets a little data specific, but a lot of the European banks are going to be selling off assets. And frankly, this is where you get the unintended consequences of some of these rules. The new Basel rules are going to make it harder for one bank to take over another bank because they'll fall into this category of these super banks that have to have extra capital. So they'll start to be selling off pieces. And we already can start to see this in project finance and others. So how that will work through the particulars of some of the Southeast Asian markets probably depends on country by country. And then you have specific issues like Thailand and the floods and other aspects. The third one you asked about is APEC. And I'll start by giving you this perspective, since you may primarily have more of a European or transatlantic audience here. At the height of the financial crisis, there was a G20 finance ministers meeting in St. Andrews in, I think it was November of 2008. It was in the fall of 2008. And I couldn't help but be struck by the fact that, St. Andrews in November, the discussion was about as dour as the sky. It was pretty gray and gloomy, okay? And I had to fly to Singapore to an APEC meeting. And so sometimes, while the travel is a killer, the sharp shifts force you to see something you wouldn't otherwise see. And what I was just struck by, the attitude at the APEC meeting, driven a lot by some of the Southeast Asians, was so different than what I encountered up in Scotland, the G20, which was a view in some ways said, look, we've seen this movie before in 1997, and we know it's not going to be pretty, but we're going to have to take some of these steps for the structural reforms and other things so that we can increase our growth prospects and productivity. It was partly a state of mind and attitude, which I think is going to be very important. And that connects me to APEC today, because the United States is a Pacific power as well as an Atlantic power. And one of the things that you're going to see in the U.S. public debate is kind of, well, as you get these shifts more broadly and globally, to what degree will the U.S. attention have to be focused on issues in the Asia-Pacific? And you obviously know this already with China and the South Asia Sea and the Sprattles and so on and so forth. But there's an economic dimension to this too. And the economic dimension is, will the United States link itself to some of the dynamism that goes on in East Asia? Now, it looks like the prime topic to get discussed at APEC this time is this Trans-Pacific Partnership, this more free trade agreement. I'm very glad the administration is pushing a free trade agreement. I used to be a trade representative. I've pushed a lot of trade agreements, including one with Singapore. But I'm a little worried that this one is more froth than reality, because from the details, about half the countries the United States already has FTAs with, so they talk a game, but as somebody who's actually had to negotiate and get agreements through Congress, I'm a little worried about kind of the reality there. But the impulse is a good one. And so whether through that method or another method, I hope that that is kind of one of the driving forces for U.S. policy, regardless of administrations going forward. But I'll just connect this back a little bit to this audience. And that is, since we talked about economics and security, this point I made about the U.S. position as both a Pacific and Atlantic country is going to be a very important one. And obviously the ties are very deep in a transatlantic community, NATO, ties of history, culture, values, so on and so forth. But if I could bring a little bit of real politics into this as well, if Europe spends the next 10 years going through crisis to crisis, cutting defense budgets and taking a narrower view of itself, it'll take itself out of that game. And it'll take itself out of the game with other emerging powers, and it'll take itself out of the game with the United States. Now, from my point of view, that would be not a good thing in the international system. That would not be a plus. But it gives you a little sense when you're reading in the newspaper about the stuff going on, of kind of the second and third order implications. This could be, this period we're in right now, one of these interesting hinge points of shifts. I was in one in sort of 88, 89, and that was a dramatic in the beginning part, and took time worked out over time. This one could be following a slightly different pattern, but it could be equally as significant. And I'll just close with this thought. It's actually a great opportunity for all of you to be studying when you're studying, because, frankly, I go to a lot of countries where people are lucky to get to primary school, much less secondary school, and you're at a great institution. And the types of issues that we're talking about, whether they be individual countries in sort of Africa overcoming conflict and security, or kind of these shifts of power and the connection or trade, these are going to be the most important things that people do. So, I plan to be at it for a few more years myself, but then it's over to you guys, and it's going to be an interesting opportunity. So I wish you the best of it.
Well, thank you very much. That's an extremely good note on which to end. I also wanted to thank you very much for going well beyond your allotted time. I know you have another engagement, so please join me in thanking Robert Zoellick for coming.